You don't belong in first class." The words hit the cabin like a sudden drop in turbulence. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. Even the quiet hum of the aircraft seemed to fade beneath the weight of that single sentence. Marcus Ellington looked up slowly from seat 2A, his expression calm, unreadable. He was a 47-year-old black man wearing faded jeans, a plain black t-shirt, and gray sneakers that had seen better days. There was nothing flashy about him. No designer luggage. No luxury watch. No signs that he was worth billions of dollars. And that was exactly the point. The flight from Chicago to Los Angeles was scheduled to depart in less than 20 minutes. Passengers were still settling into the spacious first-class cabin, placing carry-ons in overhead bins and accepting welcome drinks from flight attendants. Most barely noticed Marcus when he boarded. He preferred it that way. He had walked onto the aircraft alone, carrying only a slim leather messenger bag and a boarding pass that clearly listed seat 2A. Everything about him suggested an ordinary traveler. Everything except the quiet confidence that never seemed to leave him. "Sir, I'm going to need you to move." The voice came from a flight attendant named Nicole Patterson. She stood in the aisle with her arms folded, her smile thin and practiced. Marcus glanced at the boarding pass resting on the armrest beside him. "This is my assigned seat." Nicole's smile disappeared. "That seat is reserved for premium guests." A few nearby passengers exchanged looks. Marcus studied her face for a moment. He had seen that look before. The assumption, the certainty, the decision made long before a single question had been asked. "I am a premium guest," he replied evenly. Nicole let out a short laugh that carried farther than she intended. "Sir, please don't make this difficult." Across the aisle, a middle-aged businessman lowered his newspaper. A young woman near the window removed one earbud. The tension was beginning to spread through the cabin. Marcus remained seated. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply handed Nicole his boarding pass. She barely glanced at it. "I'll get the captain." She walked away before he could respond. The atmosphere shifted immediately. People sensed that something was wrong. Not a misunderstanding. Something deeper. Something familiar. Marcus leaned back in his seat and stared out the oval window at the glowing lights of the terminal. Beyond the glass, baggage carts moved beneath the evening sky. Ground crews prepared the aircraft for departure. Everything looked normal. Yet inside the cabin, a different kind of storm was forming. Less than a minute later, Captain Richard Hayes appeared from the cockpit. Tall, gray-haired, authoritative. The kind of man who had spent decades being listened to the moment he entered a room. Nicole pointed directly at Marcus. "That's him." Richard looked Marcus up and down. His eyes lingered on the jeans, the sneakers, the plain shirt. Then he spoke, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "Sir, this area is reserved for passengers who belong here." A silence settled over first class. Heavy, uncomfortable. Marcus slowly stood, boarding pass still in hand. His face revealed nothing. Not anger, not embarrassment, not fear, just patience. The kind of patience that comes from watching the same mistake happen over and over again. What none of them realized was that the next 12 minutes would change every career standing in that aisle. And before this plane ever reached the runway, someone was about to discover that the quiet man they had chosen to humiliate was the last person they should have underestimated. Marcus Ellington did not look away from Captain Richard Hayes. He simply folded his boarding pass once and slipped it into the pocket of his jeans. Around him, the first-class cabin remained frozen in that uncomfortable silence that follows a public accusation. Richard seemed satisfied by it. Nicole stood beside him with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. Neither of them knew they were standing in the middle of a test they had already failed. Marcus had boarded Flight 728 for a reason. 3 months earlier, a report had landed on the desk of the Skybridge Aviation Board of Directors. Then another. Then another. Complaints from passengers. Across multiple routes. Some described dismissive treatment. Others described suspicious seat reassignments. A pattern had begun to emerge. The complaints rarely mentioned race directly, but the details were impossible to ignore. Travelers who looked a certain way were questioned more often, asked for additional verification more often, moved from premium cabins more often. The Public Relations Department dismissed the issue as isolated incidents. Marcus was not convinced. That was why he was here. No private jet, no executive escort, no announcement, just a regular boarding pass purchased under his real name. He wanted to see what happened when nobody believed he mattered. Across the aisle, a woman in her early 30s quietly watched the exchange. Her name was Mia Brooks. She was a trainee flight attendant working her first month on the job. Unlike the others, she recognized something strange about the situation immediately. She remembered scanning Marcus's boarding pass at the gate. The screen had flashed green. Seat 2A. First class. Everything had been valid. Yet somehow the discussion now sounded as though he had wandered into the wrong cabin. Mia glanced toward Nicole, then toward the captain. Something felt off. Richard crossed his arms. I am giving you one opportunity to resolve this professionally. Marcus nodded slightly. And how would you like me to do that? Move to economy. The answer came instantly. No review. No verification. No attempt to check the reservation. Just a conclusion. Marcus noticed several passengers listening openly now. One man had lowered his laptop. Another had stopped reading entirely. People sensed the unfairness even if they did not fully understand it yet. Marcus looked around the cabin for a moment. The cream-colored seats. The polished overhead compartments. The carefully designed luxury that Skybridge advertised in every commercial. He knew every detail because his company had paid for every detail. Yet at that moment, he was being treated like an intruder inside his own investment. Nicole pointed toward the rear of the aircraft. Economy still has available seats. Marcus almost smiled. Not because the comment was amusing, because it was familiar. He had heard versions of it his entire life. Different cities, different buildings, different people. Always the same message beneath the words. You belong somewhere else. Richard checked his watch. We are delaying departure. His tone hardened. I suggest you cooperate. Marcus remained calm. The captain mistook that calm for surrender. That would prove to be a very expensive mistake. Because while Richard Hayes believed he was removing a passenger from first class, Marcus Ellington was quietly learning exactly who should not be trusted with the future of his airline. The tension inside the cabin continued to build like pressure behind a sealed door. Nobody returned to their conversations. Nobody reopened their laptops. The flight attendants moved through the aisle more slowly now, aware that dozens of eyes were following every decision they made. Captain Richard Hayes remained standing near Marcus's seat, projecting authority, while Nicole Patterson looked increasingly determined to prove that her judgment had been correct from the beginning. Then something happened that shifted the situation from uncomfortable to alarming. Nicole pulled a company tablet from her bag and began scrolling through the seating chart. Her fingers moved quickly across the screen. A few seconds later she frowned. Interesting, she said loudly. There is no longer a Marcus Ellington assigned to seat 2A. The statement spread through the cabin instantly. Several passengers exchanged confused looks. Marcus remained calm. Too calm. He had spent decades negotiating billion-dollar acquisitions. A flight attendant attempting to rewrite reality was hardly the most difficult challenge he had faced. Across the aisle, a wealthy couple entered the cabin carrying premium welcome drinks. They stopped beside seat 2A. Nicole immediately smiled. It was the first genuine smile she had shown all evening. There has been a seating adjustment, she explained. This seat is available for our priority passengers. The husband glanced at Marcus before settling into the seat that Nicole had effectively handed over. Neither passenger asked questions. Neither challenged what they had witnessed. They simply accepted the upgrade. Marcus watched the exchange carefully. The cabin felt different now. This was no longer a disagreement about a boarding pass. Someone had altered the story after it had already begun. Near the galley, Mia Brooks felt her stomach tighten. She knew what she had seen earlier at the gate. Seat 2A had belonged to Marcus. The scanner had confirmed it. The system had confirmed it. Yet somehow the official record now appeared different. She quietly approached another crew tablet mounted near the service station. Her pulse quickened as she checked the passenger manifest. For a brief moment she saw it. Marcus Ellington, seat 2A. Then the entry disappeared as the screen refreshed. Mia froze. She had not imagined it. Someone had changed the assignment. Back in first class, Richard folded his arms again. It appears the issue has resolved itself. Marcus looked up at him. Has it? Richard ignored the question. You will need to relocate to economy. A few passengers visibly winced. The request no longer sounded reasonable. It sounded personal. One businessman shook his head quietly. A woman near the window lowered her phone after discreetly recording part of the exchange. The mood inside the aircraft was changing. People were no longer watching because they were curious. They were watching because they sensed something wrong unfolding in real time. Mia glanced from the manifest screen toward Marcus. For the first time, she understood that this was bigger than a seating dispute. Someone was protecting a narrative. Someone was willing to bend policy to make a passenger disappear. And the more Marcus refused to lose his composure, the more dangerous that narrative became for everyone involved. For the first time since boarding had begun, Mia Brooks stopped acting like a trainee and started acting like a witness. She remained near the galley, pretending to organize service materials while her eyes stayed fixed on the crew tablet mounted beside the beverage station. The aircraft doors were still open. Passengers were still boarding. Yet the atmosphere inside first class felt less like a flight and more like a courtroom where everyone sensed the truth was hiding somewhere in plain sight. Mia refreshed the manifest again. Her heartbeat quickened. There it was. Marcus Ellington. Seat 2A. The entry appeared for barely a second before disappearing once more. She stared at the screen. The system was not confused. The system was being changed. Her gaze shifted toward Nicole Patterson, who was standing several rows ahead speaking quietly with Captain Richard Hayes. Neither looked concerned. Neither looked surprised. They looked like people protecting a decision they had already made. Across the cabin, Marcus remained standing beside the aisle. Calm, patient, almost detached. The wealthy couple now occupying his original seat avoided eye contact entirely. They seemed eager to enjoy the upgrade without examining how it had happened. A businessman near row 3 finally spoke. If his boarding pass says first class, why not verify it? Nobody answered. Richard looked toward the passenger briefly before returning his attention to Marcus. The matter has already been reviewed. The response sounded rehearsed. The businessman frowned, but said nothing else. Mia knew that was not true. There had been no review, no verification, no phone call to operations, no contact with gate agents, only assumptions. She quietly pulled out her phone and opened a notes application. Timestamps, seat changes, statements, names. She documented everything she could remember. Something told her she would need it later. Near the front of the cabin, another flight attendant approached Nicole. "Are you sure about this?" she whispered. Nicole's expression hardened immediately. Absolutely. The answer came too quickly, too confidently. Mia watched the exchange from a distance. Every minute that passed seemed to deepen the divide inside the aircraft. Some passengers still trusted the crew automatically. Others were beginning to question what they were seeing. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Confidence was leaking out of the situation. Doubt was taking its place. Then Mia noticed something else. A maintenance message briefly appeared on the crew tablet before disappearing. System modification recorded. User access. Logged. Her eyes widened. She did not have clearance to see the full details, but she had seen enough. Someone had altered a passenger assignment after boarding. That should never have happened. Her stomach tightened. She looked toward Marcus again. He still had not raised his voice. He still had not demanded special treatment. He simply stood there allowing people to reveal themselves. In that moment, Mia understood something important. The real story was no longer about a seat. It was about character, about who people became when they believed nobody important was watching. And as Captain Richard Hayes prepared to push the confrontation even further, Mia made a silent decision. If the truth needed a witness, she would be one. Captain Richard Hayes looked at his watch again. The aircraft should have been pushing back from the gate by now, but nobody seemed concerned about the delay except the passengers. The crew remained focused on a single objective. Marcus Ellington needed to disappear from first class. Richard stepped forward and lowered his voice, though everyone nearby could still hear him. "This is your final opportunity to cooperate." The words hung in the air. Marcus studied the captain for a moment. There was something remarkable about certainty. It often sounded strongest right before it collapsed. "Cooperate with what?" Marcus asked calmly. "A mistake." Richard's jaw tightened. "You are delaying this flight." Several passengers exchanged skeptical looks. They had watched the situation unfold from the beginning. They knew who had created the delay. Yet nobody interrupted. The cabin had become a place of observation. Every word mattered now. Nicole Patterson folded her arms and spoke loudly enough for multiple rows to hear. "People pay a lot of money to sit up here." Marcus turned toward her. "And I did not." Nicole did not answer. The silence answered for her. Near the galley, Mia Brooks continued documenting everything. The notes on her phone were growing longer by the minute. Names, Statements. Timestamps. She had never expected her first month as a flight attendant to feel like this. She glanced toward Marcus again. What unsettled her most was not the confrontation. It was his composure. Most people would have argued. Most people would have demanded a supervisor. Marcus simply stood there as though he already knew where the story would end. Then something happened that pushed the situation past the point of recovery. Richard reached out and took the boarding pass Marcus had been holding. He examined it briefly before shaking his head. This document is no longer valid. Several passengers frowned immediately. The statement made no sense. The boarding pass had been valid when Marcus boarded. It had been valid when it was scanned. It had been valid when he sat down. Yet somehow it had become invalid only after someone decided he did not belong. Marcus looked at the pass in Richard's hand. For a brief moment, an old memory surfaced. 22 years earlier, he had walked into the headquarters of a regional airline for a management interview. Fresh out of graduate school, top of his class, full of ambition. He remembered the receptionist looking surprised when he arrived. He remembered the hiring manager glancing at him and saying words he never forgot. "You are not exactly what we expected." The interview lasted less than 10 minutes. Weeks later, he learned the position had gone to someone with fewer qualifications, but a more familiar image. He remembered sitting alone in a parking lot afterward, staring through the windshield and realizing something painful. Sometimes people made decisions about you before you ever opened your mouth. That memory faded as quickly as it arrived. Marcus returned his attention to the present. The aircraft cabin, the staring passengers, the captain standing before him. Different place. Same assumption. Richard extended a hand toward the aisle. Economy is that way. Marcus looked directly into his eyes. Calm, steady, unmoved. And in that moment, although nobody else knew it yet, the countdown toward a very public reckoning had already begun. The cabin had reached a strange kind of stillness. Not peace, not resolution. The kind of silence that settles over a room when everyone senses they are standing a few steps away from a moment that cannot be undone. Marcus Ellington glanced at the boarding pass still in Captain Richard Hayes's hand and then calmly reached into his pocket for his phone. There was no dramatic movement, no speech, no threat. Just a simple action that somehow drew the attention of half the aircraft. Richard noticed immediately. "Who are you calling?" Marcus looked up. "Someone who needs to know this flight has a problem." Nicole Patterson rolled her eyes. "This is not a customer service issue." Marcus unlocked the phone and pressed a single contact. The call connected almost instantly. "Rachel." His voice remained steady. "Begin Executive Audit Protocol 7. A pause followed. Then a woman's voice answered through the speaker. "Sharp. Professional. Prepared. Protocol 7 activated. Timestamp recorded. Executive Review Team notified." Several passengers exchanged confused looks. Richard frowned. What exactly is that supposed to mean? Marcus ignored the question. "Preserve all system records related to Flight 728. Lock all seating modifications. Archive crew communications. Flag every manifest change made within the last 30 minutes. Rachel answered without hesitation. "Already in progress." The call ended. Marcus slipped the phone back into his pocket. Nothing about his expression changed. Yet the atmosphere inside the cabin shifted immediately. Nicole laughed, but the sound lacked confidence. What was that supposed to accomplish? Marcus did not respond. Near the galley, Mia Brooks felt her pulse accelerate. The phrase Executive Audit Protocol 7 echoed in her mind. She had never heard it before, but it sounded real. Important. Corporate. More importantly, it sounded like something Nicole and Richard had not expected. A few rows back, passengers began whispering openly now. The businessman who had questioned the crew earlier leaned toward the aisle. Did he just trigger some kind of investigation? Nobody answered. Richard stepped closer. His authority suddenly seemed less certain than it had 10 minutes earlier. "You are making this situation unnecessarily complicated." Marcus met his eyes. "No. I am documenting it." The words landed with surprising force. Across the cabin, the wealthy couple occupying Seat 2A exchanged nervous glances. For the first time, they appeared uncomfortable with how they had ended up there. Nicole quickly opened her crew tablet again. Her fingers moved across the screen. Then she stopped. Her expression changed. Only slightly, but enough. Mia noticed it immediately. Something on that screen was different. Nicole refreshed the page once. Then again. The confidence draining from her face was impossible to miss. Richard noticed it too. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Nicole hesitated. "The system is locked." The words were barely above a whisper, yet they spread through the cabin like electricity. Marcus remained perfectly still. Outside the window, the aircraft sat motionless at the gate beneath the evening lights. Inside, a different countdown had begun, and for the first time since this confrontation started, the people who believed they controlled the situation were beginning to realize that control might already be slipping away. The change in the cabin was almost invisible at first. No one moved. No one spoke. Yet confidence had begun leaking out of the people who had controlled the situation only moments earlier. Nicole Patterson stared at the locked tablet screen as though it might suddenly provide an explanation. It did not. Captain Richard Hayes looked from the device to Marcus Ellington and back again. For the first time all evening, uncertainty appeared in his eyes. The aircraft remained parked at the gate. The doors were still open. Ground crews moved outside beneath the terminal lights, completely unaware that the real turbulence was happening inside the cabin. Marcus checked the time on his phone. 12 minutes. That was all it had taken. 12 minutes for assumptions to become evidence. 12 minutes for arrogance to become exposure. A notification sounded from Richard's company device. Then another. Nicole's tablet chimed almost immediately afterward. Several passengers watched as both crew members looked down simultaneously. The color drained from Nicole's face. Richard's expression tightened. "What is it?" one passenger asked quietly. Neither answered. Marcus already knew. Rachel had moved faster than expected. Corporate systems were now involved. Every seating change had been preserved. Every access log had been frozen. Every modification carried a digital signature. Nothing could be hidden anymore. Near the galley, Mia Brooks received a notification on her crew portal. Operational review in progress. Preserve all records. Do not alter documentation. Her eyes widened. She had never seen a message like that before. The wording alone suggested executive-level authority. Across the cabin, the businessman who had questioned the crew earlier slowly stood. "I think everyone deserves an explanation." Several passengers nodded. Richard attempted to regain control. "This is an internal matter." Marcus finally spoke. "No." It became everyone's matter the moment it happened in front of everyone. The cabin fell silent again. His voice was calm, controlled, yet every word landed with weight. Nicole swallowed hard. "Who exactly are you?" she asked. Marcus looked around the cabin. At the passengers. At Mia. At the couple sitting in the seat that had originally been assigned to him. Then he looked directly at Richard Hayes. "The wrong question is who I am." He paused. "The right question is why you treated me this way before knowing." Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Marcus continued. "You saw a black man in jeans and decided he did not belong in first class. You changed records. You reassigned a paid seat. You ignored verification. You created a problem that never existed." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but the words never came. Marcus took one step forward into the aisle. His posture never changed. Neither did his voice. "You denied me a seat on an airline I own." The sentence hit the cabin harder than any announcement over the intercom. Several passengers stared in disbelief. Mia felt her heart skip. The businessman's eyes widened. Even the couple occupying seat 2A looked stunned. Richard Hayes stood frozen. Nicole's tablet nearly slipped from her hands. Marcus held their gaze. "My name is Marcus Ellington. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Skybridge Aviation, and every decision made in this cabin tonight has already been recorded." The silence that followed felt endless, because in a single moment, the story everyone thought they understood had completely changed. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. Captain Richard Hayes stood motionless in the aisle, staring at Marcus Ellington as though the words he had just heard refused to fit inside his understanding of the situation. Nicole Patterson looked down at the tablet in her hands and then back up again, hoping reality might somehow change between glances. It did not. The passengers who had witnessed the entire confrontation now looked at the crew very differently. The authority that had seemed unquestionable minutes earlier was beginning to crumble in plain sight. Then another notification appeared. This time it came through every active crew device on board. Operational hold. Aircraft grounded pending executive review. Nicole read the message twice. Richard read it 3 times. Neither could argue with it. The instruction had come from the highest level of the company. Outside the aircraft windows, ground personnel suddenly changed direction. A gate supervisor approached the aircraft carrying a tablet of her own. A maintenance vehicle stopped nearby. The flight was not leaving. Not today. A low murmur spread through the cabin. Passengers exchanged looks of disbelief. The businessman near row 3 leaned back in his seat and shook his head slowly. He was telling the truth the whole time. Nobody disagreed. Marcus remained calm. He had not celebrated. He had not raised his voice. He simply watched as facts replaced assumptions. Richard's company phone rang. The caller identification displayed executive operations. His hand hesitated before answering. The conversation lasted less than 60 seconds. Nobody could hear the voice on the other end, but everyone could see the effect it had. Richard's shoulders dropped. The color drained from his face. When the call ended, another notification appeared on his screen. Flight status access revoked. Command authorization suspended. He stared at the message without speaking. Nicole's tablet chimed again. Crew system access restricted pending investigation. She swallowed hard. The confidence she had carried all evening was gone. Near the galley, Mia Brooks received a different message. Thank you for preserving documentation. Further instructions will follow. She looked up in surprise. For the first time that evening, she felt relief. The truth had survived. A few moments later, the gate supervisor stepped aboard accompanied by a representative from corporate operations. They spoke quietly with Marcus before turning toward Richard and Nicole. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, only professionalism. The representative informed them that they were being removed from duty pending the outcome of a formal review. Additional findings from the audit had already confirmed unauthorized seating modifications and procedural violations. Richard lowered his eyes. Nicole said nothing at all. The passengers watched as years of assumed authority disappeared in a matter of minutes. Marcus looked around the cabin one final time. The same people who had witnessed the humiliation now witnessed accountability. The difference was impossible to ignore. The problem had never been a boarding pass. It had never been a seat assignment. It had been the belief that some people deserved respect automatically, while others had to earn it first. And now that belief was collapsing under the weight of its own evidence. The aircraft remained connected to the gate for another 40 minutes while operations arranged a replacement crew. Most passengers stayed in their seats, not because they had to, but because they knew they had witnessed something they would talk about for years. The energy inside the cabin had changed completely. The tension was gone. In its place sat reflection. People who had arrived expecting an ordinary flight now found themselves thinking about assumptions, appearances, and the quiet damage caused by prejudice disguised as policy. Marcus Ellington finally returned to the seat that had been assigned to him from the beginning. Seat 2A. The seat nobody believed belonged to him until they learned his title. Yet that irony was exactly what stayed with him. Across the aisle, the businessman who had questioned the crew earlier stood and extended his hand. Thank you, he said simply. Marcus shook it politely. For what? The man glanced around the cabin. For proving that dignity does not require permission. Several nearby passengers nodded in agreement. Near the front galley, Mia Brooks was speaking with the corporate representative who had boarded the aircraft. She answered questions carefully and provided the notes she had documented throughout the incident. Timestamps, statements, manifest changes. Every detail mattered. The representative thanked her for her professionalism. Mia looked toward Marcus. Their eyes met briefly. She smiled. He nodded once. Nothing more was needed. Courage rarely announces itself. Sometimes it looks like a young employee refusing to ignore what is wrong. A few minutes later, Marcus received a call from Rachel. The board has completed its emergency review, she said. The aircraft will depart once the replacement crew arrives. Additional personnel actions will be determined after the full investigation, but the findings so far are clear. Marcus looked out the window toward the lights stretching across the airport. Good, he replied. Make sure the focus stays on the behavior, not the headlines. Rachel understood immediately. Of course. When the call ended, Marcus sat quietly for a moment. He thought about the interview 22 years earlier. The parking lot. The rejection. The feeling of being measured against an image instead of a qualification. Back then, he could not change the system. Today he could. Not because he was powerful. Because he was responsible. Eventually, the new captain boarded. Then the new flight attendants. Operations resumed. The aircraft was ready again. As passengers settled back into their seats, Marcus stood one final time. The cabin grew quiet. Everyone listened. His voice was calm, steady, and impossible to ignore. The problem tonight was never that people did not know who I was. The problem was how someone was treated when they believed I was nobody. The words settled across the cabin. Respect cannot depend on a title. It cannot depend on a bank account. It cannot depend on what someone wears. The standard must be higher than that. No one spoke. For several seconds. Then a few passengers began applauding. Others joined. Soon the entire first-class cabin echoed with appreciation. Marcus sat back down as the applause faded. Outside, the pushback vehicle moved into position. Inside, something more important had moved as well. A lesson. A standard. A reminder that real authority is not measured by how many people answer to you. It is measured by how you treat the people who do not have to tell you who they are. And as the aircraft finally prepared for departure, one truth remained impossible to ignore. Marcus had not raised his voice. He had raised the standard.